In January 2023, we celebrate the story of Paul William Searle, born 7th of June 1937 in Auburn, Victoria, to parents William Searle and Violet Searle, Née Borradale. Paul grew up in Seymour, Victoria, now living on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. Paul has 3 daughters and 1 son. He has 3 granddaughters and 3 grandsons. And this is Paul's story.
My earliest memories go back to 6th grade in state school, Seymour State School, where I got 6 of the best on the last day of school. And 6 of the best is 6 straps, but in this case it was a set square across the backside. The boys had a competition of seeing how high we could pee in the boys' toilets, and of course the girls' toilets were next door. And the object of the exercise was to pee over the wall. And that was the result of getting 6 of the best. However, the other thing that I can most recall about Seymour State School were the holidays. Didn't matter all through state school, holidays. Just loved the holidays, particularly the summer holidays, because we just so much freedom. You could go swimming, you could do whatever you like. We lived in a country town. You didn't have to lock your doors of the night time. You didn't have to make sure your car was, not that we had cars back in those days, but you didn't have to make sure a car was secure so it could be stolen. So your houses were open and the streets were the same. You could just walk around the street. You knew you weren't going to be molested. The problems that you got into are the problems that you made yourself. And I just love that sort of freedom. I attended 3 secondary schools, Seymour High School, Paran Tech and Geelong Tech. Seymour Tech, I was there for 2 years, hated the 2 years I was at school, just loved sport, that's all I wanted to do, play sport and look forward to the school holidays. Otherwise, I wasn't a good student. I don't know why I wasn't a good student, I just wasn't a good student, but one of the things I can recollect is French class. We were doing French class and I ended up getting thrown out of it. And that's because I told our teacher at the time that la facture was French for the postman. And he decided he didn't like my response or my knowledge of French, so he threw me out of the French class. I ended up doing gardening and I hated that just as much, the French class. My memory of Paran Tech was I'd finished 2nd form in high school. When I started at Paran Tech, I expected to go into 3rd form, and they made me start in 2nd form, which I wasn't happy about. As a child, I didn't understand why. I can understand these days, because there was a difference between high school and a technical school. However, I will say that I started to enjoy schooling a bit more in Paran. Ended up doing drama as a subject, which I quite took to. Probably could have been an actor if I had kept at it, but it wasn't my goal in life. Paran was because my parents bought a milk bar there. And quite enjoyed the life. Loved eating strawberry chocolate frogs. I don't know how the milk bar made me money. I ate so many. However, I got involved with a group of the locals on this particular night, and they didn't know where I came from because I was new. And they told me they were going to go and earn some pocket money. And the way to earn pocket money in those days, you could get a refund if you returned soft drink bottles to to the local shop. So they were going to this shop to steal soft drink bottles, get the refund on the bottle, and that would give you some spending money. Anyhow, I thought it was a great idea until I found out that the shop they were going to steal from was my parents. So we put a stop to that one. It was all right to steal from someone else, but not yourself. The other thing I can remember about living in Prahran was I ended up getting a job as a newspaper boy, and I used to love getting on the trams at the top of our street, Greville Street, and must have been Chapel Street. The trams ran down. We went down Chapel Street, I don't know, went down as far as South Yarra, selling newspapers, then get off the tram, catch one coming back to Greville Street, selling newspapers. Sort of loved that life, and the money that it brought in, which was better than stealing milk bottles. We then moved to Geelong. My father, who was in retirement on medical grounds, was reassessed and was reappointed to a position in Geelong. I ended up going to Geelong Tech. This was a couple of techs in 1 year, so by the time the exams came around at the end of the year, second form in Geelong Tech, I was 111th out of 113 kids in the school. And as I hadn't been a good student up to this point in time, I pretty well thought that I was useless, that I wasn't going to amount to a great deal. So I must have told my mother that I was going to leave school when I turned 15, which would have been in June the following year. As luck would have it, we had our mid-year exams, because we had exams mid-year and end of the year. We didn't have term exams. So the mid-year exams must have been before my birthday. And I came 40th out of those 130 students. And I thought, no, I've improved enough that I'll put off leaving school when I turned 15. So I finished the end of the year, and I ended up in the top 10, which, as far as I was concerned, was an achievement. And then started to believe that I wasn't totally useless. When I left high school, of course, I'd been talking with my parents about a career. My father must have thought I'd make a good motor mechanic. But for some reason, I didn't want to be a motor mechanic. I applied to Victorian Rail for an apprenticeship. I applied to Ford Motor Company for an apprenticeship, and I applied to Shell Oil Company for an apprenticeship. Vic Rail offered me an apprenticeship as a painter, and I just wasn't interested in being a painter. I went for an interview at Ford, and back in those days, because we're in the early 50s, 53, I used to send around semi-trailer buses to pick up the employees, because back in 1953, people didn't own motor cars. Everyone rode a bicycle rather than a motor car. So it meant riding a bicycle from home in West Geelong to Ford Motor Company every day, which was going to be about 4 kilometres. And I decided that doing this 365 days of the year wasn't a good option. So they sent around this semi-trailer bus to pick up the employees. I got into the bus and it was just full of cigarette smoke, and I couldn't stand the smell of cigarette smoke. So that ruined out the Ford Motor Company. I wasn't going to work then. Shell, I wasn't offered a position there, so that left me nowhere to go. So my father was working at the Harbour Trust at the time, and he suggested that I should apply for a position at the Geelong Harbour Trust as a fitter and turner, which I wasn't against, did apply, was accepted. So I spent 5 years as an apprentice, basically sweeping floors and being the message boy. In the first 12 months of my apprenticeship, I learnt by observation rather than by doing anything. I suppose because you're a kid and you don't know anything, they don't trust you to do anything. However, I did pick up a lot by observation. So by the time I got to the second year, I was being given mundane jobs to do, which drove me insane. And my philosophy was the quicker I can get this done, the quicker I can do something that's more sensible. But I just ended up getting more mundane jobs one after the other. But I was known to get rip into it and get things done. So I always got the crap jobs. However, what I found is that I had 4 years of study to do as an apprentice, and the first year or the 4 years, I was top apprentice for the 4 years. So when I eventually finished my apprenticeship after 5 years, I did get an award from the Harbour Trust for being the top apprentice in the industry for that reason. I guess this spurred me on because I was achieving academically. It spurred me on to think of life beyond the Harbour Trust. And as it turned out, we were operating a fleet of tugs in the port of Geelong. And we had a deep sea engineer there that mentored me in getting certified as a marine engineer. Back in those days, there wasn't a university course for engineers as there is today. I believe it's university in Launceston is for marine engineers. Back in my day, once again, which is towards the end of the 50s, it was all done by correspondence out of the Board of Trade in London, so that you could go to any capital city and sit for an examination to become a junior engineer. So with my mentor help with the study, by buying all the appropriate books that we needed, I managed to eventually sit an exam, and I was accepted as a junior engineer. And that's what I decided to do as soon as my apprenticeship was finished, because I had to finish my apprenticeship first. When my apprenticeship finished, I applied for a job with the British Phosphate Commission. They operated a shipping line between Melbourne and Ocean Island, up in the Pacific Islands. We used to go up there and collect phosphate. That was a 30-day round trip. I was on the MV Trieste, and we could carry 50 passengers, which made it a semi-passenger ship, I guess, as well as carrying cargo. And because we were regarded as a passenger ship, we had to carry a doctor. And the doctors were appointed as a supernumerary, in a supernumerary position, whereas they got free travel. So anyone wanting to go to Nauru for a 30-day break, they could go as a doctor. which is just as well for me because shortly after I joined this company, I had the unfortunate occurrence to happen to have a boiler blow up on me. The only reason this happened, that the guy that was looking after the boiler, he wanted to leave the engine room. And he said to me, if the boiler goes out, if the flame goes out, he said, relight it for me. And I just said yes, but I hadn't been given any particular instruction as to how to relight it. And I'd never had to light up a boiler before, so I had no idea. So I did notice that after keeping an eye on this boiler for a while, that the flame had gone out. Now, what happens with the boiler, with the steam boiler, in this case, you inject hot oil into the furnace and you light the oil, and the oil heats up the water and creates steam, which is what a boiler is all about. But then if the boiler goes out, the flame's extinguished. So what you do have is a hot furnace, because this boiler's been running, so the furnace is hot. So all I did was re-injected some oil into the furnace space, put in a probe with a flame on it, and the bloody boiler blew up. Boom! I've done it all wrong. Because what I forgot to say, although the flame had gone out, the oil was still going into the furnace. The oil was still spraying in there. So we had this huge accumulation of gases inside in this furnace. And when I put in this probe with the flame on it, the thing just blew up. Anyhow, it backfired on me, and we were wearing overalls, short-sleeved overalls, open down to the waist. I happened to have a beard at the time. The thing blew back, and I got severely burnt from the elbows to the hands, on the chest and my face. And we were leaving Melbourne at the time, so the passengers must have had a hell of a fright because they were all having dinner when I set off this explosion. But as luck would have it, we had this doctor on board, and it turns out he was a burn specialist. Lucky for me, because he just took me up to the hospital on the ship, put me in a seawater bath, and basically left me be, because that's what they did with burn patients back in those days. It had been found during the war that the greatest survivors of burns were Navy personnel, because they were generally immersed in seawater, and that reduced the amount of shock, and the shock reduced the infection. So I just spent a month on board this ship recovering, which I did. The other thing that I can remember about the Trieste, and that was the fact that being a passenger ship, we had 50 passengers, and we were the only ship in the line that carried 50 passengers. The other ships might have carried a handful. So everyone preferred to come onto the Trieste because there were a group of people, and we used to have our party nights, which we called hoolie nights, because we were having a hell of a good time. So Saturday night we had one of the engineers. He was just a natural musician, played the piano accordion. One of the officers on the bridge played a guitar. There was someone else that played a ukulele. And I decided that I would make myself a bass I just made this out of an oil drum, just the way they do with a bass where you make it out of a tea chest. So we formed a band. The piano accordionist, he would just call out the chords that he wanted the guitarist and the ukulele player to play, and they would harmonise, and I would try and join in with the bass. So we became known as the party boat, so that all the residents that were travelling between Nauru, that's where we were going, Nauru and Melbourne, always wanted to get onto the Triaster because, you know, we provided a bit of entertainment, so they were good nights. My next recollection of the Triaster was when you come into port, one of the engineers is appointed as a shipkeeper. And the shipkeeper's role is to look after the mechanical aspect of the ship for 24 hours. And it's got nothing to do with seniority, because we have a chief engineer, second engineer, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and I was the eighth. So I was the junior of the juniors. I was the eighth engineer. I was shipkeeper. That means to say that I had to say, theoretically. However, I'm shipkeeper this day. We had a work come aboard, and he had to inspect an oil tank. And we had no idea how much oil was in this tank. It did have a gauge on it, but we weren't sure whether it was working or not. So the worker were trying to determine how much oil was in this tank. So there was a man on the tank held about 5 tonnes of oil, so it was a good couple of metres high, might have been 3 metres high. And there was a manhole cover halfway up the tank. So I instructed the worker to back off all the nuts on the manhole cover, half a turn, give the manhole cover a tap with a hammer, which was with the pressure of the oil inside in the tank. So if there was oil in the tank, it would leak out. Unfortunately, what he did, he backed off the nuts, so there was only half a turn left on the nuts. The tank was full of oil. He gave the manhole cover a tap with a hammer, and the bloody thing just blew off. So it flooded the engine room with oil. There's oil running everywhere. And unfortunately, it was running over one of the generators. So I was in charge. I was on duty for the day. So I had to rush. The tank was up in the funnel, so I had to run from the funnel all the way down to the lower part of the ship and shut one generator down, start up another one. It was just chaos. And the mess, the absolute mess. Black, thick oil just running everywhere. So I wasn't the most popular guy on the ship. So anyone can take a guess as to what happened next. So that meant my next ship, I joined the Australian National Line, and they were an Australian shipping company that ran on the coast at that time. I joined the Australian National Line. My first ship was the SS Murchison, a steamship Murchison. And it was berthed in Portland at the time. And I was going with a girl, and she lived in Port Fairy, so we happened to be in Port Fairy, and I left Port Fairy to take up a position on the ship. This time I was going to be fifth engineer, only because it only carried 5 engineers, so I was still the junior of the juniors. And I really liked the Murchison. Had a beautiful, beautiful sense of being at sea. Steamship is just so quiet as compared to a diesel engine ship, which I'd just come from. So a steam engine ship just doesn't make any noise. Your diesel engine ships are loud, noisy things. The steam engine ships, no noise whatsoever. So they just whisper their way along through the sea, slowly rolling in the waves. Really beautiful sensation. Don't know how long I was on the Murchison, the River Murchison. But I transferred there to bulk ships, lake class ships, Lake Macquarie, Lake Colac, and they were just on what we call the black and tan. They ran from Whyalla in South Australia to either Newcastle or Port Kembla in New South Wales. We would take coal to Whyalla, and Whyalla we would take iron ore back to Newcastle. And that's all they did. They didn't do anything else. Boring, absolutely boring. As it turned out, I was on one of these ships for a full 12 months. I was so bored with it because at this stage I hadn't managed to get back to my home port, which was Melbourne. So I hadn't seen Melbourne for over 12 months. I kept writing into the management to see if I could get transferred to another ship. And it wasn't happening. Except for the day that I left the ship to go on annual leave, we happened to go into Melbourne. And I was telling the fourth engineer about my problems and wanting to be appointed to another ship. And I'd been knocked back probably about 3 times. And he said, we'll go in and we'll have a chat to the PR manager. And I point blank refused. I said, no, I'm not crawling to anyone. And he said, no, it's not crawling. He said, that's public relations. And because he put a different term on it, I quite like public relations as against crawling. So I said, that's not a bad idea. So we went into town, met the public relations guy, spent the day getting pissed, and he eventuated that the PR guy just said to me, look, anytime you want to change the ship, he said, just let me know. And he said, I'll organise it. So that's when I discovered about life psychology, the psychology of life. Had my leave, and I was appointed to cargo ship, MV Boonaroo, yes. So the cargo ships, there were half a dozen of these ships, and they sailed from all the major ports in Australia, starting at Perth, go round to Adelaide, Adelaide to Melbourne, Melbourne to Sydney, Sydney to Darwin, Sydney to Brisbane, and Brisbane to Cairns, and then back again. Great, relaxed lifestyle. Plenty of port time, so you had a reasonably good social life if you were single. The thing that I remember about social life on the cargo ships is visiting Darwin. The normal visit to any of the major ports would be a week to unload and reload. In Darwin, they didn't see ships all that regularly, so the wharfies kept us there for a month. They made sure we stayed there for a month because there was always another ship due into port, gave them something to do. Otherwise, if there was no ship, there was no work, no money. So they just kept us there. But we used it to our advantage because what we did, we'd just get onto the nurses' home, ring up all the nurses to see who was available. We'd have party nights. We might have 2 or 3 a week. Yeah, it was quite incredible because we used to kid ourselves that we were doing a day's work in what we call tropical hours. We would start at 6 and work till midday. We'd do a 6-hour day, and call it quits for the day. We'd go up to town and get into the pub first, spend the afternoon in the pub, get back to the ship, and then we'd get a party. The next ship with the Australian National Line was the Princess of Tasmania. I think on the Princess I might have been 7th engineer. Spent about 6 months on the Princess from memory. Nothing really to report about other than it was a ferry that travelled between Melbourne and Burnie. Actually took my wife on a trip there at one stage. She enjoyed it because being a passenger ship, she was able to get out and enjoy the party life, whereas I was too busy working. The next ship was the MB Bass Trader. This was another ferry, had limited passenger space. The passenger space was limited to the driver of some of the trucks that went over there. Otherwise, it was a full drive-on, drive-off container ship. Very interesting ship. Probably the ship that I like most. Of all the ships I've been on, this is the one that I like the most. Got no idea really why. It was revolutionary in its design. And I say that because when I was on the lake ships and on the cargo ships, they were engines that weighed 200 tonne. Weighed 200 tonne. They produced 2,000 horsepower. When I was on the Bass Trader, we had a ship that produced 2,000 horsepower from 5 tonne weight. So it was a very compact engine, very noisy, extremely noisy, high-speed diesel. Ran at about 5,000 revs from memory. Had to wear earmuffs in the engine room, so damn noisy. But an interesting ship nonetheless, because it had a lot of technological features that the other ships that I've worked on didn't have. One of the most interesting things I can recall about the Bass Trader was some rough seas we got involved in. We could have been a potential shipwreck, leaving Port Phillip Heads, but as it turned out, we weren't. At this stage, I would have been 5th engineer because we only had 5 engineers. But we were leaving Melbourne and they'd closed the port to shipping. So that meant to say that nothing could come through Port Phillip Heads, either in or out, except the ferries. And we were leaving to go to Devonport. So when we were leaving, the Port Phillip Bay is as rough as I've ever seen it. We had waves that must have been 3 or 4 metres high. That's unusual for Port Phillip Bay. We're approaching Port Phillip Heads and we've got an ebb tide. That's to say the tide is running out through the heads. But there's a storm at sea out in Bass Strait, and that's got waves that are something like, I'll say 8 metres high. I'm just guessing, but they were high. They were big waves. So you've got a tide going out and you've got waves coming in. And that's the waves coming in are like being poured down a funnel, and the funnel is the distance between Queenscliff and Portsea. So you've got all these waves being channeled into this small, narrow opening. So that just becomes a wall of water. And I really mean a wall of water. So we're leaving the port. I happened to be on duty, but I wasn't 5th engineer at all. I was 2nd engineer at the time. So we ran into this wall of water. Now, here's a ship that's normally running at about 5,000 revs, engines running at 5,000 revs a minute. we hit this wall of water. The engine revs dropped back to 1,000. There's a hell of a bang and a thump because all the accommodation block is situated right on the bow. I thought, what the hell has happened? Because I'm in the engine room. You're below the waterline. You've got no idea what's going on outside the walls of the ship. And you think, what the hell has happened? But what had happened is we'd hit this wall of water and it was so huge it stove in the accommodation block. It pushed the steelwork of the accommodation block sitting on front of the bows back about 2 or 3 feet. So really destroyed the accommodation block. Didn't destroy it to the extent where it was only superficial damage, just that all the steelwork had caved in. But the rooms behind the walls, well, they were a mess. So we hit 2 or 3 of these waves, each one subsequently less than the one before, until we broke out into the open sea. And at this stage, because the ship, when it got to the peak of a wave, the propellers came out of the water and that caused them to over-rev. And I was in the engine room, in charge of the engine room. And my immediate thought was, because this was a bridge-controlled ship, so it was all being run from the bridge, I immediately disconnected the bridge control to reduce the engine revs, so they might have gone screaming to 10,000 revs, I don't know. And I just brought them back to revs that were more acceptable. And then the next thing I'd know, I'd have the bridge screaming at me, more revs, because we're going into the next wave. And you'd have to get it's extremely dangerous. So I had to keep the revs into the engine when you're running into the next wave to have the power to get through it. And then when you broke through that wave, it'd start over revving again. You'd have to shut the engine, reduce the engine revs down so that the main engines didn't blow up. So we eventually got out into the open sea, and we had twin screws. That means we had 2 engines, 2 propeller shafts, 2 propellers, 2 propeller shafts, 2 engines. One of the engines had failed. It had blown itself up. So we were left with 1 engine to run over to Devonport. We got over to Devonport, checked out the engine that we'd gone over on, and we found it had to be replaced. Lucky for this particular ship, we carried a spare engine with us because they only quite small, they only weighed 5 tonne. So we had one engine we couldn't do anything with. The engine that had took us over to Devonport, we had to pull it out and put in a new one. So we came very close to foundering going through Port Phillip Heads. So replaced the engine, simply returned to Melbourne, and they took it out of service while all the necessary repairs were carried out. The other ship that I can recall with ANL, Australian National Line, is the MV Mount Kira. And this is a ship, it was my first appointment as a senior engineer. I gained my second engineer certificate. I was appointed there as 3rd engineer, and it was my first senior appointment. And I'd have to say this is the ship I hated the most. It was modern at the time that it was built, but it wasn't as revolutionary as the Bass Trader. But it had different innovations in it, just with the progression of time and knowledge. I'd have to say that there were innovations that even the chief engineer on the ship didn't understand. Because this was a ship that, when I was appointed to it, it was being built in Whyalla. So I went over to Whyalla, spent some time. Engines had been installed, so we spent some time familiarising ourselves with the ship before we could take it on to sea trials. One of the incidences I can remember about being in Whyalla was because it was in the construction stage, they had no safety rails. Can't remember if that's the right word, but they had no safety rails on the ship. So with the tide increasing and decreasing, the ship could come up to a level where the deck of the ship was level with the wharf, and then there were no safety railings around the side of the ship. So this particular day, we came back to the ship, had been ashore, came back to the ship, and they just had a gangplank that went from the wharf onto the deck of the ship, and you just walked over the gangplank. Another taxi pulled up behind us, and some of the crew got out, the Pistis parrots, all carrying, or one of the guys was carrying a case of beer. He walks across the gangplank, walks from the wharf across the gangplank onto the ship, stumbles, walks backwards, steps back onto the wharf, goes around at the front of the gangplank and walks across the gangplank again. I just stood there amazed, absolutely amazed. But that just reminds me of another incident that I can recall. This is when I was in the on the cargo ships, because the engine room would be the equivalent of a 4-storey building inside the ship. And we had this guy, they were called greasers. They had to come around and they would oil or wipe away excess oil on components that weren't automatically oiled. So that was just a part of their process. They would walk around the engine room. They didn't have much to do. They'd just walk around the engine room, put a squirt of oil here or mop up a patch of oil there. That's basically their job. Anyhow, we were in port this particular day. No, we went in port. The ship had broken down. That's right, the ship had broken down. And so we pulled out what we call deck plating, which is like the floor, between all the levels. So if you were standing on the uppermost level, the 4th floor, you could look right down through all the decks, the various decks, down to the bilge area, which is the very bottom of the ship. We'd broken down, so there was no need for this greaser to do anything, but he was pissed. So he's walking around with his oil can. The engine stopped running. He doesn't need to oil anything. Steps through the bloody hole on the top deck, and away he goes. And I thought, there's a dead man, absolute dead man. But he fell. We'd remove the plates in such an area that when he got to the bottom level, there was an air vent there. And the air vent, they're a tubular vent and they have flares at the end. So when the air is rushing out, it'll go full 360 degrees. And he hit the edge of one of these flares, tipped him the right way up because he's falling head first, tipped him the right way up. He lands on his feet, walks up the bloody ladders, picks up his oil can and starts squirting. All the bits and pieces that he's meant to be squirting. Been in the marine industry from 58 until 65. During that time, I did have a girlfriend, and we were eventually married in, I think, 1961. So having relationships when you're at sea is quite a difficult thing, because you don't know whether the girl you're going with is the one you're going to marry or not. However, I did marry my girlfriend, and we were married in St Patrick's Catholic Church in Port Fairy, because Margaret came from Port Fairy. So when we were married, we honeymooned on a Bull's hire cruiser on the Hawkesbury River. My only recollection of this, because back in the 50s, these boats weren't as luxurious as they are today. We ended up with 2 single beds. So I would say, as far as a honeymoon goes, not the most attractive proposition to be stuck in a boat for a week, living in single beds. You find that one bed becomes too uncomfortable. Prior to getting married, of course, I bought and had built in Geelong, in the suburb of Highton, which was an outer suburb back in those days. We had built a home, which is where we went to live. Over our married life, we had 4 children. We had 3 girls and a boy. I will say that I found family life difficult when I was at sea, because most of the time I spent at sea, which is, as I said earlier, I was requesting different ships so that I might get back to my home port so that I could carry on a relationship. Of course, that doesn't happen when you're at sea. So the upside of being married at sea is that you have a lot of extended holidays. So that when I was due annual leave at sea, we were awarded for every weekend we spent at sea, we were given 2 days in lieu of having worked the weekend, as well as being paid penalty rates for the weekend. We were given 2 days off. So if we were at sea for a full 12 months, there's 52 weeks, 104 days. That was added onto our annual leave, so that when I did come ashore on leave, we had there 3 or 4 weeks, whatever it was at the time, plus another 104 days. So we ended up spending quite a lot of time at home, which also introduced another interesting aspect of sea life, because with that much time on your hands, with 3 months leave, you eventually ran out of money. So what most of us used to do was go and get another job. And this is where I had a lot of prior job experiences, is working at alternative jobs while I was at sea. To keep my wife company while I was at sea, we bought a boxer dog. And this is, of course, before we had a family. The interest in the dog only lasts a short period of time. So after a bit of discussion, we decided, and I will say we decided, we always sat down and talked about what we were going to do, that opening a business of some sort would probably keep Maggie interested, or provide enough interest to fill in a time while I was at sea. So we bought we set up a card and gift shop in Kylie. That lasted about, I'll say 12 months. I can't really remember. I can remember I came back on leave at one time, and I said to Maggie, "How's the business going?" And she said, "Oh, it's going well." And we must have been in Colac at the time. So I said to her, what are all these default notices you've got here? What are they all about? Electricity bill unpaid, this bill unpaid, some other bill unpaid. Oh, she said, I've been waiting for you to come home. You can sort that out. So what I discovered is this business had been going well. Maggie's spending all the money. She's spending the bloody lot. So I decided, and neither of us knew a thing about business back in those days. So I decided the best thing to do was close it down. So we just shut it down, took the losses, got on with our lives. It was just an interesting part of our life. It was probably just as well that we did close the business down, because this is when we had our first child, and that was a daughter. And we ended up having 2 more daughters, which is a good thing, because there's every chance I would have become a male chauvinist if it wasn't for the fact that I had 3 girls. And I was then able to work out that girls are just as intelligent as boys, and they deserve to have the benefits of a good life just the same as a man does. So having decided to close down Maggie's business, I also decided to give up the sea life and look for a job ashore. And that was more difficult than I at first thought, because I'd had some experience during my annual holidays during my seagoing career. I was able to try a few different jobs, none of which worked out. But however, I happened to be down on the waterfront in Geelong one particular day, and there was a ship there unloading cargo. And I thought, now I wonder where this, and it was machinery. I noticed it was machinery. I thought, now where's this machinery going to? So I followed one of the trucks, and it turned out it went to a place called Hike Australia. And what I discovered about this company, it was an American company, and they do a weaving process, but it's connected with the paper making industry. So they were making all the paper making felt that goes through a paper making machine. It's actually a conveyor belt, but it also drives a lot of the machinery. And the wet pulp is just dropped onto this fabric belt. The water drains through the belt and you're left with pure paper. And that's what this company was manufacturing. So I approached them and asked them about a job. And at that time, there weren't any jobs available. They offered me a job as a fitter and turner. And as I'd come from a fitting and turning background, and I always used a better salary than what they were offering, I just said, no, not interested. So I started looking elsewhere. I thought about opening up my own engineering business, different thoughts that I had about what could I do. And I found that I wasn't getting anywhere. So after about a month, 6 weeks, I went back to Hike and I said, is that job still available as a fitter and turner? And they said, yes. So I said, I'll take it. I thought, I'll do this for a while until something better comes along. So I was there 6 weeks, and I had this request to go into head office, which wasn't where they were building the factory. So I go to the head office. I met the manager, general manager, and he said to me, how would you like the job of chief engineer? And I said, but you've already got a chief engineer. He said, yeah, but I'm asking you. He said, how would you like the job of chief engineer? And I said, well, I'd accept it willingly. And he said, well, it's yours. Which I laughed about. And I said, oh, yeah, that's okay. I said, then I asked about salary and when I was to take up the position. So I had to wait 6 weeks because they had to give the current engineer 6 weeks notice. The salary I wasn't happy about, but it was better than what I was being paid as a fitter. And it was probably quite a good salary, but not as much as I'd been used to at sea. But however, that's what I started doing. I ended up working at Height for 5 years. I got a salary increase every year. Well, there was a personnel review every year, of which I managed to get a salary increase every year. And that was simply because of innovation that I put in place, just through experimentation and inventiveness. So it was a job I was quite happy with. Stayed there for 5 years. They had a change of management. Didn't get on with the new management, so I decided to leave. What I haven't mentioned at this stage that in these 5 years, I had the birth of 2 more daughters, Kate and Kylie, which added to the number in our family. No boy. My wife and I discussed what to do next, and we decided we'd try business again. So we thought we would buy a milk bar. We looked around Geelong for a milk bar. Wasn't anything that we liked. It's not to say we didn't like it. The areas the good milk bars were in what were known as commission home areas back in those days. And because we were living in a semi-affluent suburb, we decided we couldn't lower our standards to live in Geelong and operate a business in a commission area. So we looked at Melbourne. And the interesting thing about Melbourne is that we ended up buying a milk bar in what is largely a poor economic area. However, it turned out that milk bar was very, very successful for the time that we were there. One of the highlights, or not so much a highlight, but one of the points of interest that I can remember about being in the milk bar, we had a great Sunday trade. People used to come in. We were known for the bread we used to have of a Sunday. We had an independent baker, and he was delivering us bread of a Sunday, and we built up quite a traffic flow to buy this bread of a Sunday, and it all used to be displayed in the front window. So people would come in from mass on Sundays or church on Sundays, and there'd be a huge influx of customers, anyhow, best way I could put it, to purchase their loaf of Sunday bread. This particular Sunday, our second daughter, Kate, she was only about 2, 3. We had her in a pusher sitting out the front of this business, in front of where all the bread was. And realising that we were going to have this influx of customers, we decided we'd better bring her inside, because we just put her out there so she, get a sense of the environment, what sort of a day it was, whether it was sunny or bad weather, and to see people coming and going, just to be part of life. So we brought her inside. We hadn't had her inside more than 15 minutes. Car came in from church, straight through the front window, right where Kate had been sitting in the pusher. So we regard that as a fortunate part of our life, that it didn't end up any more dramatic than that. However, the other thing that happened while we were in that business, and the second event, is what made us decide to sell the business. We found that the kids were being, it's not so much seduced, but they were being seduced. It's the only way I can said, by adults. And once we realised what was happening, we decided, well, we don't want to live here because, something could happen to one of the three girls. So we decided to leave. But I will say that during the same period, we were fortunate enough to have our fourth child, who was a son. And a son after three girls was a bit of a blessing as far as I was concerned. But he's been a pain in the arse ever since. With a couple of those incidences that occurred in that milk bar, we decided to leave. Oh, something else I'd like to mention too is that during the period in the milk bar, decimalisation came into being.
In come the dollars, in come the cents, to replace the pounds and the shillings and the pence. Be prepared, folks, when the coins begin to mix on the 14th of February, 1966. Who are you? I'm Dollar Bill, and I've come to tell everyone that decimal currency will be here from the 14th of February, 1966.
50-cent coin came into being. We'd never had the equivalent of a 50-cent piece in imperial currency. And because these 50-cent coins were a novelty, we started collecting them. We just put them in a jar. They must be reasonable sized jars because I can't really remember, but we had a few of these jars. Anyhow, we sold the business, and we thought, well, we'll buy in a better area. And we bought a business in Glen Waverley. Now, there was 8 weeks we had to wait between vacating one business and going into the next. So we thought, what do we do? So after thinking about it, we borrowed a caravan from a friend of mine, and we went caravanning for 8 weeks. And it was during that 8-week period I decided that I was going to go into the caravan business. Knew nothing about the industry, but I was going to go into the caravan business because it was the world's best kept secret as far as I was concerned. So after our 8 weeks holiday, we moved to Glen Waverley. And the day we moved into the business, I put it back on the market because we were going to go into the caravan industry. The only observation I can make about the Glen Waverley business, it was like chalk and cheese if you compare the Thomastown business to the Glen Waverley business. Thomastown, although it was in a poor area, it was a cash area. If they had money, they spent it. If they didn't have money, they couldn't spend it. When I was living in Glen Waverley, it was an economy that was based on credit. So everyone was mortgaged to the hilt. They're buying cars they can't afford, sending kids to schools they can't afford. So they've got no money to spend. So they come into the shop and they want to put it on credit. So you'd let them run up a credit bill. Then you'd ask for the money and they'd refuse to do business with you because you were denying them their right. I guess that's the only way you can think of it. So all I can say is I'm pleased that we put the business on the market the day we moved into it because it's not an area that I liked. I didn't like the economy, and we probably didn't make anywhere near as much money out of that business as we did in Glen Waverley. Because when we're in the Thomastown business, that 8 weeks that we spent on the road in the caravan was paid for out of business because I used all the 50-cent coins out of the jars, so I didn't have to use any assets whatsoever. However, we then decided, because we're going into the caravan industry, we're going back to Geelong. I discussed this with a friend of mine. We were going to go into partnerships and open a caravan business. Now, neither of us knew a thing about caravans other than he owned one. I hadn't even except for a brief stint, I hadn't actually worked in sales as a salesman. So I knew nothing about selling. But like most people that think they can sell, I thought, it'll be easy. And it's far from easy until you try it. So we get back to Geelong, found a manufacturer who happened to be Chesney. They were located in Box Hill at the time. They were manufacturing caravans in Queensland. There was a storage yard in Box Hill where they kept all their Victorian stock, and I just drew from that stock and opened a business in Geelong after I'd found a yard that was semi-suitable, because nothing's ever ideal when you try and go into business. You try and find the best spot, but the best spots are invariably the most expensive. And when you're starting up, you're trying to cut your costs. So started off in this business. I was taking about 50 cents a day wage to feed myself, because my wife was supporting me by working. She was working as a teacher. She was a qualified teacher. So she was the one supporting us at this stage. Been going into the business about 3 months, selling Chesney caravans, and Chesney caravans were known as the Rolls-Royce of caravans in the industry back in the day, back in the 70s. The problem with them selling them in Geelong, they were disadvantaged by the fact they had quite a considerable freight bill. So they were dearer by a large amount of freight that we had to pay than the local product. So it wasn't going to be a volume turnover business. So I've been going about 3, 4, maybe 5 months, and I happened to be getting my lunch one day in the milk bar, local milk bar, and I ran into the bank manager, and he said, "Oh, you better come down and have a talk to me." So I said, "Okie doke." And so I found some spare time, and I went down to the bank manager and just made an inquiry, what is it you want to talk about? Why am I here? And he said, "Oh, you're not going so well." And I said, "How would you know?" He said, "Well, I am your bank manager." And he said, "I can see your figures." He said, "I think you should come back in about another 6 weeks and we'll have another chat." And I said, "Fine." So I went back to the business, hadn't been, maybe a week or a couple of weeks. And I had this gypsy walk in. And a gypsy back in the 70s would have been unusual to see. I couldn't even remember. But I know he had earrings and he had a strange hat on, but he looked like a gypsy. And I just thought to myself, "Oh, here's trouble. I've got to be careful with this bloke." Anyhow, he ordered a caravan for me, because I like doing custom build caravans. I could build a customer's requirements. And this guy explained to me that he and his wife had been working at International Harvester. All they were doing was eating, sleeping and working. Their family had grown up and moved away, so there was just the two of them, and they weren't really enjoying life. So they decided that they'd buy a caravan and they'd follow the picking seasons around to earn a living. And I thought, "Oh, this all sounds great, great lifestyle," because I really like caravans at this stage. I'd only use them for a holiday. I thought, "Oh, yeah, well, it's another use for a caravan." As long as you can find, you can get around the countryside, as long as you can find an income. And that's what they were going to do. So anyway, it came time to pay for this caravan. He brought in a personal cheque. And he's a gypsy. And I thought, "Oh, I'm not happy about this." So I just said to him, "Okay, look, let's go down to the bank and we'll cash this cheque together." And he said, fine. He was happy about it. So we go down, we cash the cheque. I'm happy I've been paid for the caravan. we're driving back to the yard from the bank, and he said to me, he said, hope this doesn't take too much longer. He said, I've got to get home. I've got some furniture to sell. And I said to him, what sort of furniture is it? Because I'd just bought a home in Geelong, which was an old Victorian house, probably about 90 years old at the time. A lot of heritage value about it. And he had furniture, and we didn't have a lot of furniture. And because we'd been living in a caravan when we started the business, I bought a caravan, and the four children, and my wife were living in the caravan. In the depths of winter, the 4 kids were living in an annex. Anyhow, but they had great freedom because they had a lot of friends. They had a whole caravan park to run around in and play in. Anyhow, so we bought this house, and I needed to buy furniture for it. And I asked him what sort of furniture it was, and the way he described it, it sounded like antique furniture. And I said, I could be interested in this. I said, can I come and have a look at it before you sell it? And he said, yeah. So I drove out to he had a residence somewhere out in the countryside. And the residence itself was an original brick building. I can only remember one room of it, but there would have been more than one room. But this building had a dirt floor, compacted dirt floor, had a big chimney at the back where they did the cooking and heating from, and you fed the timber into it through a hole in the back of the chimney, so it could all be fed from outside. He's got a chain stuck up the chimney with a cooking pot hanging over the fire, cooking his evening meal, which was sausages. And so we get out to his property, inspect the furniture, and I said, we could be interested in this. We worked out a deal. So the money I'd made out of this caravan, I spent on all this furniture. And I just think to myself, God, the bank manager will be pleased. He will be thrilled to bits. But I will say that I never had to go back to that bank manager again because he never called me back. But the interesting thing about not being called back, I started with Chesney Caravans, as I said. After some time, one of the local car dealers decided that he wanted Chesney Caravans as a dealership. So he just offered Chesney a better deal than I could, and I lost that dealership. And this is when I got into building custom-built caravans because I had to get another manufacturer. The problem with this particular manufacturer, he was Lebanese, and I've found with the Lebanese, their right hand doesn't know what their left hand's doing. So what they gave you today wasn't necessarily what you were going to get tomorrow. And I found this really disheartening because you'd order a caravan for someone, and the materials, all the interior materials had changed. They'd even changed the shape of the caravan sometimes. And invariably people like this, they always had a factory fire because it was just a sign that they were going broke. Yeah. So anyhow, that didn't last long at all. So I then had to look for another manufacturer, and that was Capricorn Caravans. Capricorn Caravans, I've got to say, they really set me going on the right path because I liked customising, and they were good at customising. And it seemed to me that Capricorn and myself, we were talking out of the same hymn book, that the message I gave them about what I wanted in caravan is what I got, because we didn't go in for detailed plans back in those days. It was just a verbal description, and you had to be aware of what you could and what you couldn't do in redesigning a caravan. So probably lasted with Capricorn for a couple of years. Then, unfortunately, the Capricorn owner, their business became so busy, he decided to move into a new factory. Unfortunately, when he was working in that factory, he must have been working on a forklift, standing on a pallet, working overhead, and he fell off the forklift and killed himself. So the family decided that they wanted to close the business, so I was left without a manufacturer again, no supplier. Then I looked into Queensland, and I got involved with a manufacturer in Caboolture called Glendale. They were a Canadian manufacturer that had a manufacturing arm over here in Australia. So I took on Glendale, but this happened to be right at the time when the caravan industry was starting to go backwards. And it was starting to go backwards because of the 7-day war in Israel. And what it did was drive up fuel prices. Fuel prices went up, and the cars we were driving at the time, which were V8s and 6 cylinders, just became unpopular. They introduced Cadillac converters to cars, and all that meant was that the vehicles of the day, when you were putting it into a new cars they were producing, wouldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding, let alone tow a caravan. So the caravan went from building vans, anything up to 30 foot in length, to building what we now term pop-ups. And the pop-ups, the original pop-ups, were 10 foot long, 11 foot long. They were just small so that they could be towed by the new cars that were being produced. So the industry basically crashed. At that stage, there were 13 dealers in Geelong. Ended up, I was one of 3 left. Everyone else got out of the industry. And I thought about getting out of the industry, but I just stuck with it. And I went through some very, very difficult times. We had to compete against a retailer in Melbourne that was selling his vans for $500 profit. And we had to compete with it and, close your door. And $500 wasn't sufficient return. So you had to get volume. And because of that, I was suffering. When things were going well with Capricorn, I bought a block of land alongside me to make the yard bigger. I rented a block of land 3 or 4 doors away and went into the swimming pool business. But that failed, and that failed pretty quickly. Our business was going so bad that I had to sell this block of land again. And we weren't getting any customers coming through the shop. I happened to be sitting in the office one day. I got a phone call, and the guy said to me, there's a caravan yard closed down in Geelong. He said, they got a portable office out there. He said, would you be interested in towing it back to Geelong? And I thought, well, for an income, I'll do anything at this stage. So I went out to this block of land, which had a caravan yard on it, in one of the most undesirable positions I've ever come across in Geelong. And to pick up this caravan, or this mobile office. And when I peeked through the window, I could see all this paperwork in there. And I thought, God, a lot of paperwork in there. So I broke into the van, went through the paperwork, and found out they were selling more vans in a week than I was selling in a month. And I thought, there's got to be something about this site that I'm missing out on. So I decided to vacate the site I was on, and I took over this new site. And that site was out on Port Arlington Road, Denby Street, corner of Denby Street and Port Arlington Road. So went out there. So I got out there, moved the stock out there, and I had about an acre of land that I was renting, nominal price. Most unattractive looking yard I've ever seen, and put my stock on it, and it was like a pimple on a pumpkin, I thought, how am I going to fill this place up? It looks empty. So I went and bought trailers from a Melbourne, garden trailers from a Melbourne manufacturer. Used to go and buy a truckload at a time, bring them back to the caravan yard. And I thought, this will help supplement the income. Give me a bit more to sell and a bit more to make money out of it, but you don't make a lot of money out of trailers, but it helped the cash flow. So I'm sitting there wondering how can I fill this yard up? I get a phone call this particular day, and one of the other sales yards in Geelong, they were getting out of their caravan industry. They were one of the 13. They were getting out of the caravan industry, and they said to me, "Oh, we're getting out of the industry. Would you be interested in selling our stock?" And I said, "Oh, love to," because their stock had helped pad my yard out. So I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'd be more than happy to do." He said, "Well, there is a condition." I said, "Oh, yeah, what's the condition?" He said, "We're going to send a salesman with him, with the stock." And I thought, wonderful, because here I am. I'm in this sales yard all on my own. It's out on the outskirts of town. I had trouble going to the bank. I had, just trouble, period, being there on my own, but didn't have any staff whatsoever. Used to do my own cleaning. I used to do it all myself. So here I had a salesman that wasn't going to cost me anything. So we picked up all this stock, and the salesman I picked up, his name was Phil. And Phil said to me, he said, "I've never sold caravans before." He said, "I don't know how I'll go." And I said, "But he'd been selling camper trailers." And I said, "But you're selling camper trailers, aren't you?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, it won't be any different." I said, "It's just a bigger version of a camper trailer. I said, you can sell one, you can sell the other." And he just said to me, "Oh, well, I hope you're right." And off we went. So I've got a free salesman, basically free stock, plus my own stock, trailers, and Phil. And things starts to turn over, not quickly, but they were turning over. I wasn't going broke. And Phil said to me, because he'd come out of the camping industry, and he said, "Oh, what we should do is put in some tents." And I said, "Well, I know nothing about tents." He said, "Oh, well," he said, "that's where my knowledge comes in." So we ordered a whole heap of tents, and we were able to pad the yard out a bit more. So we filled it up with tents, little camping tents, mainly little camping tents, 2-man, 3-man, 4-man tents, all European stuff. So at least the yard looks to be 3/4 full. And we're selling a few tents, we're selling a few trailers, we're selling off the stock from the defunct manufacturer, and we're selling off my stock. But I still didn't have a dealership because I got out of the Glendale. Anyhow, I got I must have been ad in the paper that Millard were looking for a dealer in Geelong. They were already being sold out of a complex in Geelong, but that complex was selling 6 different brands. So my observation would be the salesmen were taking the least line of opportunity and selling the van that the public wanted the most, and it wasn't a Millard. So Millard weren't happy with that arrangement, and they put an ad in the paper. I replied the ad, ended up getting the dealership. The Millard manager came down from Sydney, met both Phil and I, and Phil and the manager got on like a house on fire because they were both interested in dog racing, and they really hit it off. So. And the Millard guy, because the industry was in such dire straits, he said, "Now look," he said, "I don't want you to do anything stupid." He said, the main thing here," he says, "I want you to stay afloat." He said, "So don't go investing in stock that's not going to sell, He said, "I want you to make a profit." And they were the words of wisdom that he left us with. And he said, "But anyhow, you can come to Sydney. We've got a range of stock there that we're selling at discount rates. You can have a look at it and see if there's anything you want." So Phil and I flew up to Sydney, had a look at his stock, ordered 10 units, had them transported back to Geelong, put a back page ad in the local paper, and lo and behold, sold the 10 units within a month. I thought, unbelievable, just unbelievable. And they were bloody horrible caravans too. Anyhow, they had the old 12-volt lighting system in them, which most caravans have always had 240 volts. These had 12-volt lights, and they were bloody. It was worse than reading by candlelight. So anyhow, we sold these 10 Millards, and I said to the sales manager, I said, "Have you got any more stock left?" He said, "Oh, there's not much left," but so we flew up to Sydney, picked over more stock, had it delivered back to Geelong, and got rid of that as quick as we did the first lot. The next thing I know, the manager came down to see me, and he said, "You guys are going well." He said, "I'd like to offer you a deal." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "For every one you buy," he said, "we'll give you 2. And I thought, oh, not to be sneezed at. So I ended up with 3 vans. So I managed to fill the yard up a bit more. So by this stage, we've sold out of the yard that's closing down. We've sold all this stock. And I've got Phil, and I said to Phil, because he wasn't costing me anything, and I said, "Oh, I'm going to have to put you on the payroll, but I don't know how we're going to manage." So I put him on the payroll. We didn't have to worry about it. I knew nothing about business, knew nothing about finances, nothing. I was just learning to sell. And so I put him on the payroll, and sort of away we went. We never looked back. They were some of the better years in the caravan industry, and although we were having to compete with $500 margins back in Melbourne, we were getting volume. So, we got out of strife. Unfortunately, Phil ended up with face cancer and died. So I then put on a sales manager, which to some extent worked. And I suppose in a lot of cases it didn't work. But it worked because this guy was one of the best salesmen I have ever come across. But his problem was he couldn't earn enough money. He spent more than he earned. So Phil died, but what I'd like to mention was before he died, because Phil and the sales manager from Millard got on so well, it was suggested that I might like to do a caravan show. What I haven't mentioned up till now is I did my first caravan show back in 1972 with Chesney, and I hated it. I was at a caravan show for 7 days and didn't sell a thing. And I just found it boring and uninteresting, and I thought I'll never do another caravan show in my life. So here I am with Millard Caravans, and the sales manager is asking whether we could do a caravan show, and I just point blank said no. Not the slightest bit interested. Well, because Phil and he got on so well, Phil really wanted to do a show. And I said, okay, if you can do a show, fine. I said, if you can sell 5 vans, I'll be happy. If you get a couple, I'll be happy. But I said, if you can sell 5, fine. So we go to our second. I didn't go. Phil, I hired another salesman. So I sent 2 blokes to Melbourne to do the Melbourne caravan show. I get a phone call on the first day. Paul, you got to get down here. We're being overrun because we were on this stand, on the Millard stand, and there were only 2 dealers that I can remember. It was myself and Doug Thorley in Melbourne. And I had 2 salesmen and they had 12. So Phil felt we were being overrun. And he said, you got to come down and give us a hand. So the show started on Thursday. He rang me on Thursday. I said, okay, I'll come down Friday in the afternoon. So I went down Friday afternoon. The show didn't close till 10 o'clock at night. And when the show finished at 10, we drove back to Geelong. We had to get up again in the morning for a 10 o'clock start on Saturday morning. And I said to Phil, we can't be running backwards and forwards to Geelong every bloody night. I said, we're going to have to stay here. So organised accommodation in Melbourne, and we stayed in Melbourne. So on the Thursday, they hadn't sold anything. On the Friday, they sold one. On the Saturday, I just can't remember the numbers now, but let's say we sold 8. I can't remember. Anyhow, by the end of the show, and the show's a week long, we'd sold 26 caravans. And I was ecstatic because if I'd have got 5, I would have been happy. And I thought if we somehow or other magically we could manage a 10, I'd be ecstatic. But here we are, we got 26. I thought, how the hell did this happen? Get back to Geelong, sold a lot of vans. You've got no idea how it increases the paperwork because your paperwork's got to change. But anyhow, that's another side of just being in business. My next recollection is the fact that from this caravan show, the second one that I ever did, by the Saturday night, we'd exceeded my minimum requirements, and Phil and I were sharing a room together. The other salesman put him up in another room. Phil and I are sharing a room together. And Phil said to me something like, I wouldn't mind a partner. And I said to him, if you think I'm walking around Melbourne, because the show's closed at 10 o'clock and we've had a feed, so it must be about midnight. And he said to me, I said to him, if you think we're wandering around Melbourne at midnight looking for company, I said, you got another thing coming. He said, no, you don't have to do that. He said, all you got to do is pick up the phone. I said, what the hell are you talking about? I was just innocent. And he explained to me what it was all about. And I said, well, you can do it. I said, but I'm not. I said, we've had such a good show. I said, I'll shout you a night out. So he gets on the phone, he organises some company, hangs up. He's no sooner hung up than the phone rings again, and it's the night manager. And he said, I just happened to overhear the conversation. He said, I'm just letting you know. He said, there's a room available somewhere else in the facility. He said, you can have it for $20. And I said, that's mine. So that was fine. That was Saturday night. And anyhow, Sunday night, we have another successful day. And Phil said again, he said, that was so good last night. He said, I wouldn't mind trying that again. I said, well, we've had another good day. I said, you go right ahead. So I shouted him another night. And he was a character. Phil didn't drive. And I used to pick him up, take him to work, and I'd take him home from work pretty well every night. And there was one night that I'd left work and I left him with the keys to lock up. So wherever I'd been, I came back and I said, I'll come round to your place to pick up the keys. So I drove round to his place, I don't know, about 8 o'clock at night, knock on the door, and this beady-looking face peers around the door, and he's got a ruddy complexion. So you've got this red hairy chest, and he's just cracked the door open, and he says, is that you, Paul? And I said, yes. I said, have you got a woman in there? And he said, yes. I said, you're mad. I said, bloody Linda will find out what's going on. I said, there wouldn't be a woman in the world that wouldn't know what's going on. And so I picked up the keys and I left. So all I worked out from that Phil is probably one of the horniest blokes I've ever met. He couldn't keep it in his trousers. The other good thing about the caravan industry that I really, really liked, as distinct from my seagoing career, I was home with my family, and we were able to celebrate all the school holidays together. Now, it's distinct from my time when we only had a mid-term break. These days, or mid-year break, these they have a term break, so you've got a first term and second term. So we could go away on holidays for the first term and the second term. And Christmas time we used to spend at Bowen Heads. We'd set up a caravan down the Bowen Heads Caravan Park for 6 weeks. I would commute to work every day, and the family just enjoyed themselves having a family, meeting new people, having friends, and generally misbehaving themselves as kids do. As far as the term holidays are concerned, we used to go to different places. One of them I can recall is Zumstein. It was cold, so we were lighting fires. You sit around the fire at night time, just telling stories, roasting marshmallows. Used to roast marshmallows. Generally a great time. During the day, I can remember had a video camera at this stage, used to take the video camera and we'd make a movie. It could be someone falling off a cliff, so you'd show them at the top of the cliff and then you'd show them lying on the ground. Just absolutely great times. We always invited a friend to come with us so that we had company. And out of that developed an Easter tradition of going to Cobram. And when I say camping, this is basic camping. Basic. You had to take your own toilet. You had to dig a long drop to use it. You had to wash in the river. And so that's what Cobram was all about. And because we'd been in the habit of asking friends to go with us on some of our earlier camping trips, we also asked friends to go with us on the Cobram trip. So I think the first Cobram trips, there were about 4 families. So if there had been 4 kids for family, then, you got 4, 4, 16 plus the adults, 2, 4, 6, 8. You got a heap of people. And they were great times. The first year we ever went there, to Cobram, there was 2 other groups that set themselves. We were camping on the riverside, on the Murray River, and there were a couple of other groups there, and these 2 groups were playing volleyball, and they invited us to have a challenge round of volleyball with 3 of us. I'm probably sick of playing just one-on-one. And we said, okay, so we had enough adults and kids that we set ourselves up into a volleyball team. And away we went. And the first game that I ever played, I sprained my back. I put my back out somehow. I don't know how. So I ended up being I called myself the coach because I couldn't play. And so we had this 3-way competition, and as it turned out, we won the damn competition. And one of the exciting things, or the highlight about the final game, was that we were winning, and to put us off, one of the opposing team's wives stripped the gear off, got everything off, and she's running around the court stark naked. Absolutely hilarious. Yeah, great. So we had a great time selling Millard. I was sitting in the office one day, a car drove in. Guy jumps out of the car, walks into the office. "Are you Paul Searle?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm John Carr. I own Viscount Caravans." And at that stage, Viscount owned Millard. And I said, "Oh, yeah, what can I do for you, John?" He said, "Do you want Viscount as a dealership?" And I said, "Well, what are the conditions?" He said, "I didn't ask you about conditions." He said, "Do you want the Viscount dealership?" And I said, "Yes, I'll have it." They were the best-selling caravan on the market at the time. So I said, "Yes," So I ended up with the Viscount dealership. But anyhow, a couple of years later, Viscount went broke. So it wasn't a good decision, as it turned out. They went broke. Things were tough there for a while. But because it had been going well, I decided that I'd like to buy a block of my own. And that involved moving from Drylesdale Road to Queensland Road. So I bought this block in partnership with a guy, and things just didn't work out. Once again, because I didn't have enough financial nous, I was probably paying more rent, or I owed the bank too much money. Business had gone backwards, and in 1990 I was banking with Pyramid, and Pyramid went bust. And I had just written a cheque to Custom Credit for some considerable amount of money, and I'm sitting in my office thinking, what happens to this cheque I've written to Custom Credit? So I rang Custom Credit to find out what the status of this cheque was. And they said, well, that means we haven't got the money. And Pyramid have gone broke. So they sent someone down at the yard to do a stock valuation because they wanted to know I had enough assets to keep trading. But the upshot of it was that the day Pyramid closed its doors, I was technically bankrupt. And so I traded for a couple more years, trying to get out of it. But after 20 years in the industry, I'd had enough. I was suffering with ill health, sick of the industry after 20 years, which I think a lot of people, when you go through a long period of service in the one industry, you get tired of it. So I decided to close the business down. When I closed the business down, I had a call from, I'd been home for about 6 weeks doing nothing, wondering how I could amuse myself. I'd done all the repairs I could do on the house. I got a phone call from a company called Roadstar Caravans. And Roadstar Caravans wanted to know if I could do 6 weeks' work looking for new dealerships for them because they were having problems that had run. They weren't getting enough sales. So I said, okay, I'll do that for six weeks. So that 6 weeks turned into 4 years. And I ended up, while I was with Roadstar, I ended up starting up Compass Caravans because we couldn't get enough Roadstar dealers. I introduced them to the concept of setting up another division, which was Compass Caravans. And we tried to do it differently and cheaper than Roadstar because Roadstar had set themselves up as a premium brand. So we were doing Compass, and that worked out quite well for a while. I think what happened then was I ended up with prostate cancer. Also, while I was working with Roadstar Caravans, I had the pleasure of running the Sydney Caravan Show for the Sydney dealership. What had happened there was they'd taken on 2 dealers. So they had Roadstar and they had Corrimal. And the owner preferred Corrimal. So he had committed to taking Corrimal to the show, whereas Roadstar had to convince him to go to the show, and they convinced him by suggesting that someone outside the organisation could run it, and that was me. So I had the pleasure of running that show. It was at Rosehill Roadscourse in Sydney. Absolutely wonderful setting. And that's a show where my son Ben had his second experience of selling caravans. But he did have the distinction of being the equal first salesman that year, and he had very, very limited experience. So, and that set him on his own journey. I decided it was time to leave Roadstar. Health, I suppose, distance from the actual head office, not that mattered too much for the job that I have. So we ended up parting ways with Roadstar. I then bought a business in graphic design. Because I'd had prostate, I decided that I had to work closer to home for a start off, and that's when I decided to buy into this franchise business, which sounded great when it was explained to me, but as it turned out, it didn't work out as well as it could have. But I think one of the reasons it probably didn't work out the way I would have liked it is because of my inexperience in the graphic design industry. So I had to teach myself how to use a computer, and I have to teach myself graphic design. And one of the things I've recognised in life, you can't be an expert at everything if you haven't been trained in that discipline. You're very lucky if you can just pick something up without any training. So that came to an abrupt halt. Then I decided it'd be a good idea to buy into a hotel. And to do that, I enlisted the aid of the family. So we ended up buying a hotel in Gatton. I was only in that 12 months and I was diagnosed with bowel cancer. Couldn't have happened at a worse time. We also had a family disagreement, so half the family left. And I basically had to semi-retire at that stage. So it just left one of my daughters and her husband running the business. And my view of that is that we got ripped off after that point in time with theft. So that didn't work out either. That's a period in my life I'd like to forget. One of the things I can remember about being diagnosed was I had to go to see a specialist in Toowoomba, and he insisted that I have an operation the very next week. And I said to him, well, what's my prognosis? And the prognosis for all different cancers have got different prognoses. And mine was I had 5 years, and that wasn't good enough for me. And I just said to him, hypothetical question. No, what I did say to him was, can you be any more definite than that? And he said, no. And I said, well, here's a hypothetical question. I said, if you had a patient with my condition, walked in here and you want him to have an operation the next week, I said, what's his lifespan? And he said, 12 months. And I said, well, all the more reason I'm not going to have an operation. And he turned to me, very unprofessional, of course. He said, I'll bet you $100 you're not here in 12 months. Here we are, 23 years later, and I'm still here. So all I'm going to say is don't take too much. Be aware, but don't take too much notice of what bloody doctors tell you, because they're not always right. Having come back from that diagnosis, not having the operation, I decided I would try out alternative therapies. And one of the therapies I tried out was a German therapy, which they were using back in 1937. And that was basically to have a broth diet, have nothing but broth 3 times a day. And the idea behind it was that if you're not eating anything, the cancer will die and you should pass it. But anyhow, I tried that for a couple of years and it hadn't worked. And I had to have an operation in 2000. The only reason I had the operation is because my bowel blocked up. But I've often wondered why I didn't get secondary cancer in that 2-year period. So maybe the alternative therapy had some bearing on it. I don't really know. Here I was, quite ill, spent a couple of years recuperating. We'd sold out of the hotel by this stage, living with my daughter Kate in Maroochydore. Spent about 12 months or so there. Probably after that period of time, felt well enough. I went and rented a unit not far away, so I was close to the family. And that unit was close to the Maroochydore Bowls Club. And to go shopping, I had to walk through the Bowls Club every day to the shops. So I'd walk there, have a rest, go to the shops, come back, have a rest at the bowls club, back to my unit. And after doing this for a little while, I thought, I reckon I could play bowls, because I was always sporting mad right throughout my life. So I went along, had a couple of lessons, started to play bowls, and then the pennant season came on. And I thought, I don't know how other sports operate, but football in Victoria, when I was playing down there, if you decided to play for a team, you got a game. It was as simple as that. You wanted to play, you got a game. So I decided I wanted to play pennants, and they laughed at me. And I said, well, what's the problem? And they said, well, all the pennant teams have been picked. And they said, unless someone drops out, you can't get a game. And I thought, oh, well, that's okay. So nothing happened. They play a round of pennants, and I've not been picked. And the second week, because I hadn't been picked, I made other arrangements. Second week, would you like a game of pennants? I said, well, I'd love to play pennants, but I've made other arrangements. Anyhow, the third week, into pennants, are you available this week? I said, yes, I'm available this week. So I started my bowling career in pennants as a lead, and fell in love with it, enjoyed it. Enjoyed it to the extent that I bowled at Maroochydore Bowls Club. Spent a couple of years there. In that couple of years, about 1.5 years, in playing pairs, because I was playing lead all the time. I decided analysed the skips that we had, and some skips were just hopeless. And I used to think to myself, I can bowl better than this skip. I thought I'd like to be a skip. And once again, they laughed at me, because to be a skip, you had to serve 7 years bowling so that you knew all the technique. It's not the way the modern system works, but anyhow, that's what it was like then. So after 1.5 years, I started skipping, and amazingly, I started winning some games. So a couple of years, I'm starting to feel better, and I thought, well, I was still relatively young. I thought I need another business. So I bought a business in Cairns, motorbike wreckers. Bought that. Apparently you need a licence for motorbike wreckers. I didn't realise that at the time. I didn't realise it, but the guy I bought it off, he said, oh, you can just use my licence till you get one of yours. Get your own. And I said, oh, that's okay. But what you find out is that licence is untransferable. You've got to get your own. So the next thing I knew, I had the local Department of Labour on me because I didn't have a licence. They were going to close me down unless I got a licence. So I ended up getting a licence, and was selling wrecked motorbikes. That really didn't work out, because I thought, because it's part of engineering, I thought I'll understand this pretty quick, but there's a whole lot of knowledge, background knowledge you need for motorbikes. But I had a bloke working for me that was quite experienced. He knew all that. And we were going on quite well, but he left. And then I couldn't find anyone to replace him. So at the end, then I had a couple of thefts. I must have got offside with a motorbike fraternity, and had a couple of break-ins, and a couple of decent bikes that I was trying to sell was stolen. So I thought, oh, I've had enough of this. So I closed that down. Then I went to work for a salvage company in Cairns. That lasted for a few years. And then my son happened to call me one day and said he'd like to go into business, caravan business. Would I give him a hand in the caravan business, because I had a background knowledge? And I said, yeah. So I left that business and moved to Bundaberg with Ben, and guided him in setting up his own caravan business. Of course, Ben had previously sold caravans, so he knew what it was about. But I found with the prostate operation that the service work was becoming too much for me. So I think I might have left Bundaberg. Ben had got himself established. I might have left Bundaberg and I went to live with the daughter for a while. But then I went back to Bundaberg for some reason or other, which I can't remember. However, I went back to Bundaberg and I was just doing, because I was aged, my health wasn't all that crash hot. I was just doing restoring vintage caravans for Ben, and actually loved that. Did a couple of good restorations. I was buying the odd caravan for myself, doing whatever work was necessary to put it in a saleable condition and sell it. And I was on a buying trip to the Gold Coast to buy myself a caravan to refurbish it. I was staying with my daughter Anna when I fell ill. Was taken to Sunshine Coast University Hospital and found that I had a ruptured bowel. That's where I ended up in St Vincent's Aged Care, where I'm living today. So here I am living at St Vincent's. People have often asked me how I like it, and as far as I'm concerned, I couldn't be in a better place. I have a motorised mobility scooter, which I can get around on. I live close to the Plaza Shopping Centre in Maroochydore. I can get out and about pretty well any time I like. And I'm relatively self-sufficient. So I regard myself as not a hard patient to look after, but we're not called patients, we're called residents. And I would have to say that I enjoy living here. I like most of the staff. So all in all, I think St Vincent's is a good place to live. We've got a library which we can use, which is where we're doing this recording at present. We have a theatre if we need to use it. We have registered nurses on staff. I live in a 4-storey building, so we have a registered nurse on every floor. So there's immediate attention if you need it, and a doctor calls once a week. So what more in life can you ask for when you're ageing and your health's failing? Before I finish, I'll just cover some of the more memorable highlights of my life. And the first one would be being apprenticed as a fitter and turner to the Geelong Harbour Trust, because that was a dead set fluke. It was not intentional. It's just something that happened. Having got into the Harbour Trust, I then decided to become a marine engineer. And because I wanted to be a marine engineer, you had to have served your time as a fitter and turner in a heavy engineering shop. And the Geelong Harbour Trust was classed as that. So I had the first requirement out of the way. I was working in the right place. And then I also had a mentor who had the greatest effect on my life, because he's the one that pointed me in the direction of marine engineering. So if I decided to become a marine engineer, I had the right workshop and I had someone encouraging me to follow the profession. My second highlight would have been receiving the junior engineer's certificate, because most of my life, up till I was 20 at this time, I'd not regarded myself as being a good student. And it took going to tech to make me realise that I wasn't as dumb as I thought I was. And so I was tickled pink beyond belief to even contemplate the fact that I had gained a higher degree of professionalism by being a marine engineer. I went on to become a second engineer. You also need a qualification for that. I never stayed long enough to worry about being a chief engineer because I'd decided to go into business. But however, that was then The next highlight would have been marriage, being married. Absolutely loved it. I've realised I'm a family man at heart. That comes across because I'm an only child, so I was raised without siblings, knew nothing about the opposite sex, right? However, my wife came from a family of 5, and I always admired her family life. So one of the things that I wanted to do was emulate what she had. So I wanted to have a wife and I wanted to have children, which basically what I did, had both wife and children, and all the enjoyment that it brings, along with all the frustration, sadness and bad times. But at the end of the day, family life is it's the glue that holds society together. I enjoyed all the holidays with my family, which I've already mentioned, school holidays, Christmas holidays, Easter, and that is probably the single biggest pleasure that I've had out of married life. Another highlight of my life was meeting Phil, who I met by accident. He was a Geelong resident, been there for years, knew everyone in the town, knew their religion, knew as kids who went out with who was married to who, what affairs were going on. He absolutely knew everything about anyone, but we'd never met. He was such a great bloke. We became the closest of friends. We were like chalk and cheese. His strengths were my weaknesses, and my strengths were his weaknesses. So we complemented each other, which is one of the things in business that I think you need. You've got to have someone that can provide you with a different perspective about where you're going, because if you don't have that, you become single-minded and you just keep making the same mistakes all the time. So I'd have to say that Phil was one of the highlights. But the highlight of my life, actually the absolute greatest emotional moment of my life was while I was here in St Vincent's. My family decided to put together, my wife had just died recently, and she had committed her body to science. So the family didn't have a chance to say farewell. They didn't have closure. Not the same way you would if there was a funeral. And because of that, and I'm still alive and kicking, they decided to celebrate my life while I'm still alive. And we had a weekend here in Maroochydore, here at St Vincent's, where I invited a lot of the residents, and we invited quite a number of family, close relatives, and they all came up for the weekend. And it is everyone I've spoken to, including the residents who knew nothing about the family before they arrived, they said it is one of the most emotional weekends that they've had. Everyone thoroughly enjoyed it. We had a couple of people from St Vincent's that attended. When I say staff from St Vincent's, we had residents that attended. I had friends that live in not an aged care, they live in an over 60s village. They attended. Everyone that was there said what a wonderful weekend it was. And from that's why we're making this video, because Ben thought it would be a good idea.